right, welcome everyone to the first of our weed webinars in a series of 5. I'm Karen Clausen. I'm from the Manitoba Organic Alliance, and really thank you for taking an hour out of this beautiful day that we're having to come and join us. So earlier this summer, we put out a survey asking all organic producers to tell us what kind of problem weeds that they have. And they indicated that there was a really large variety of weeds that were problematic. And from that list, we took the top weeds that were identified, and then we asked the key scientists who are doing research in this area and some farmers how they're actually managing these weeds. So for this series, MOA is partnering with Dr. Entz's Natural Systems Agriculture Research Group at the University of Manitoba. So grad students from that group will act as moderators for each webinar and will ask questions of our guests. Dr. Entz will also be on hand for each webinar as well. So we'd like to really thank our sponsors who've made this extension work possible. For this webinar, we have FCC, Weed Surfer, MacDon, and MASC. And we're also really pleased to have a grant from the Canadian Agricultural Partnership, which is funded by the federal and Manitoba governments to support our extension activities. If you're an agronomist, you'll get some CCA credits for each webinar. So at the end of each webinar, we'll put in a unique code that you can scan with your phone. So later today, you'll receive an email with a link to the recorded webinar where you can review it at your leisure as many times as you like. If you have any questions that occur to you during the webinar, please type them in the chat box. You'll see a little chat icon, so just click on that and type them in there. If we have any time, we'll ask the speakers to answer them. And if we run out of time during this webinar, we'll email the answers to you when the speakers have had a chance to give some of your questions a bit of thought. I'm going to pass this over now to Will Bailey Elkins. He's a master's student in Martin's group, and he will introduce our first speaker.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I think we have a really great and interesting hour planned. So first, we'll sort of dive into some sort of a good intro into mainly cultural weed control methods with Brenda Frick, and then at the end, we'll sort of wrap it up with some discussion with our farmers, David Rurik and Alan McKenzie. So let's get right into it. I'll start by introducing Brenda. So Brenda has a PhD from Western University in Plant Sciences and a long history of extension work on organic weed control in the Canadian Prairie. She served as Prairie coordinator for the Organic Agriculture Centre of Canada, based at the University of Saskatchewan, where she now teaches a course on weed control in organic agriculture. Brenda is the author of Organic Farming on the Prairies and co-author of the Organic Field Crop Handbook. She wrote a weekly column on organic agriculture for the Western Producer for many years, and more recently has worked as a private consultant as a partner in Resilient Solutions, consulting on agricultural projects, including the Prairie Organic Grain Initiative. So thanks for being here, Brenda, and I guess we can get right into some questions. So I guess let's start off with a big question, and I guess weeds have quite a bad reputation in agriculture. And my first question is, are there benefits to weeds that we often forget about? And do you think we need to change how we think about the presence of weeds in the field and essentially our perception of weeds in the field?
Yeah, I would say absolutely we need to rethink that. A lot of times we have the see a weed, kill a weed, kind of no thought involved kind of perception, but weeds are just a natural part of how the world works. When there are disturbances, and there are lots of things that cause disturbances in a natural landscape as well as in an agricultural landscape, but when there are disturbances, weeds are the first responders. They rush in there and start covering the earth again. The earth needs to be covered, and weeds do that. And they do all of the wonderful things that having green cover does. Mm-hmm. So if I can have the next slide on this, Karen? Or maybe not.
Karen says she's lost internet.
Okay. Well, that's okay then.
Well, I believe the slide was a nice image of the weedy growth on the side of the road in Grasslands National Park. And it was just a nice group of weeds with in full bloom.
And I included that only because it's in Grasslands National Park. And so even in a natural area, once you cut a swath for the road, weeds will occur.
Absolutely.
And yeah, we hear a lot nowadays about regenerative agriculture, about the necessity or the desirability, at least, of keeping the ground covered with living plants. Weeds do that. They have all of those benefits for the soil of keeping the ground covered. They're also our biggest source of biodiversity in agricultural systems. They give the creatures that eat our crops something else to eat. They provide organic matter, and thus they provide food for all of the soil microorganisms. They turn over the nutrients when they have all of that living biomass. So they're very helpful that way. They sequester carbon dioxide, they provide pollen, they provide habitat. And there are a lot of things that weeds in general do. There are some specific weeds that we have identified as particularly helpful. Mustard family weeds, for instance, and there are a lot in that family, but they exude acids from their roots that might make phosphorus more available, for instance. There are a few legume family weeds, and that, of course, helps with nitrogen. And some people will consider leftover alfalfas and sweet clovers and whatnot as weeds in the crops following their green manures, but they're still helpful. Even while those can act as a bit of a windbreak, there are also all sorts of other ways of looking at weeds as if you wanted to consider them as harvestable, as medicinal plants, as crops, as bioremediation, as ways of looking at things that help you identify problems. Like if you've got a lot of foxtail barley, you probably have an alkaline patch. That weeds screened out of your crop can be used as feed. And the weeds themselves are good food for us, for livestock, for whoever. And a number of them are legitimate medicinals. There have been scientific studies of cancer reducing properties of dandelion extracts, for instance. And
I have in my personal experience eaten plantain and made a nice green oil as a garnish for using wild plantain. And I think, my research mainly focuses on organic intercropping. So obviously there's this concept of interspecific competition between the two crops. And I just like how you're always framing about the importance of diversity, because I found that discussing intercropping with someone who's new to this concept, like a researcher or even a farmer, it's hard sometimes to accept a certain amount of competition with the crop. Now that we've moved towards this industrial sort of monoculture system, and it's so focused on eliminating all competition with the crop. But I guess we really need to think about accepting a certain amount of it.
Well, and as you look at intercropping, particularly, intercropping with weeds is something all farmers do all the time. They should be a little more familiar with the concept, perhaps, because it is happening. And yeah, sometimes there are negative effects, but sometimes there are positive effects, and you have to kind of consider what the balance is.
Absolutely. And now I think we have that photo up of some of the native plants or weeds in Grasslands National Park. Hopefully everyone can see that. So
perhaps not native, but yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Grasslands Park. Yep.
So I guess, sorry, go ahead.
We could whip through the next up until the picture of the kid blowing the dandelion puff if you want. Yeah, this is just in the spring, weeds cover the ground. That's what weeds are for. Next. Oh, we missed the wild oat or the wild mustard one. No, this is the next one. Yeah, they're good. Whatever. We're fine.
Beautiful. So I'd like to maybe start by delving into some of the key components of cultural weed control. And maybe we can almost move through a season of production while touching on some of these aspects of cultural weed control. So my next question is, in the late fall and winter, what should farmers take into consideration when they're going through the development of next season's crop plan?
Okay. Well, to start with, cultural control is simply all of the things you do in the culture of the crop that gives the crop every advantage. And we need to consider that the absolute best weed control is a strong, healthy crop. If I could have, say, slide 8. This is a picture, when we get to it, of a beautiful, the next one. Nope. Yeah, this is a picture of a beautiful oat crop. And it was going along, yeah, okay, can we go back? And this is what the oat crop looks where the oat crop is, but the slide that we were looking at just before this was where he had a cedar miss. The cedar quit at this point. There was a problem, and you can see the difference between where the cedar was doing well and where the cedar was not doing well. So if we go to the next slide, no, maybe. Yeah, the crop is a beautiful crop of oats. You don't see a lot of weeds in there, maybe a little wild oats, but it's not a very weedy crop. Can we go to the next one? Even looking down into it, there are a few little teeny weeds in there, but I wouldn't be worried about any of those.
Mm-hmm.
But where the crop is not, then the weeds are. So this is the potential of that whole field for weeds, but where the crop is, the weeds are well controlled. So I think when we're looking at how to give the crop its absolute best advantage, that's when we're looking at cultural weed control. You asked about fall and winter planning. In the fall, there's still work that needs to be done that's actual work that addresses weeds, like cleaning out your crop or making sure everything is well done. But basically, you can start reflecting on what happened in the previous season. And I think there are 3 things I would focus on. How is your soil fertility at this point? If you had a strong, high-yielding crop, that indicates that you had good soil fertility, but it might also indicate that you used it all up. I would consider soil testing, but a lot of farmers have a good feel for how much they have left in there. I would look at what specific weed issues you had that year, and if you had any idea as to why those were problems. Is that a just this year problem, like it started raining on June the 1st and didn't stop until August the 3rd? Then that's maybe just a this year problem. But if you've got specific kinds of weeds that seem to escape from your management, it's time to consider what you can do to change that. And I'd also consider where you are in your rotation and what it's time to do. So
for soil testing, do you prioritize sampling in the fall or over this maybe spring sampling?
Yeah, maybe we should ask Martin that one, but I don't think it matters a lot, provided you do it at the same time each year so that you have a similar kind of estimate, so you have an idea where that is.
Mm-hmm. And so once it does come time to seed in the spring, I guess how can the timing of seeding impact weed suppression?
Yeah, okay, we can go there. The timing matters in both the crop aspect and in the weed aspect. Some crops can handle going into cold soil, some need warmer soil to go into, and so that makes a difference. And you might want to use that as part of your rotational strategy. So if you seed early into cold soil one year, you might want to seed late into warmer soil the next year. It also makes a difference as to which weeds are your problems. If, for instance, you have a weed that's problematic to you, say wild oats is a problem to you, you might want to wait until the wild oats have germinated. You might want to encourage them to germinate by a little light tillage. Wait till they germinate and then kill those at seeding. So that's a little bit later seeding that gives the wild oats a chance to be there. But if your main problem is something like pigweed, they don't, or green foxtail say, they don't really come up until it's warmer. So getting the crop in early will put the crop way ahead of the weeds, and there's an advantage to that too. With most weed control things, it's best to vary it from year to year so you don't give a consistent advantage to those weeds that like what you do.
I was surprised this year to learn just about, how much foxtail a crop can potentially take. At least that's what I've read in scientific literature. So I guess understanding those weedy sort of thresholds that a crop can handle is important as well.
Well, foxtail is one of those things that could be 2 inches tall and you have 10,000 of them per square foot or something that seems like that. Or it could be something that's 3 feet tall and even a dozen is a nuisance. So it really depends how they're doing, how much of a problem they are. But largely they just dry, often, a bed of green foxtail can just dry up the surface, keep other things from germinating and not causing a whole lot of problem.
Absolutely. Are there any slides that you want us to maybe move to that we may have skimmed through, or?
Well, let's move to, let's say 14 at this point.
Okay.
That's Martin's rotation, by the way. Yeah, one of the things about what to do, yeah, the one before that, we'll get to that one. What to do is to get there first. It's kind of a first come, first serve situation out in the field with the plants. And so you want to establish the crop ahead of the weeds, whether that means early or whether that means managing the weeds and then putting the crop in. And even once you've put the crop in, if the weeds come up furiously before the crop actually does, you can do a little bit of blind skimming or something like that to remove the weeds that are there early. Because basically, if the weeds, particularly wild oats, for instance, if the weeds are there ahead of the crop, they will be very competitive. They will be a problem to the crop. If the weeds come in later, a couple of weeks makes a huge difference. If the weeds come in later, they won't be nearly the problem.
And I think we've touched on some of the really important aspects of weed control, cultural weed control, when we're discussing the spring, and maybe we could move further into growing season and even into harvest. And what steps can farmers take to manage their weed seed bank now that the crop has been established and even getting closer into harvest as well?
Okay. Can we just click the slides, like the next one after this one? The one with Neil's picture in the corner? Yeah, I just wanted to mention this one. Yeah. Okay. This was the skimming pic. Yeah, that's the one I want. We think that these things that we do have a tiny little effect. And maybe it seems that way when you're comparing your results to the herbicide guy next door. But some of these are not tiny little results. One of Neil Harker's studies suggested that if he both used a good rotation and a high seeding rate and a strong cultivar, he got 70 times the wild oat suppression of not using a rotation and using the average seeding rate and using a lousier cultivar. So, you know, this can make a huge difference, these little things that we do along the way.
And when you say lousier cultivar, do you mean you know, maybe
Yeah.
a forage type cultivar, and then with seeding rate, increasing the seeding rate?
Increasing the seeding rate for sure. Usually at least 1.5 times, but I see farmers using 2, even 3 times, depending on their crop, and usually at good advantage. The weedier it is, the higher the seeding rate, in the sense of, again, making sure that most of the nutrients go to your crop. Most of everything goes to your crop because you've put so many of those little croplings out there. There was another question in there, wasn't there? Something about cultivars? Yeah. Some cultivars are just generally much more competitive than others. And generally, those are the ones that farmers refer to as jumping out of the soil, you know, the ones with a quick start and kind of an aggressive character, those that leaf heavy, that are tall, that really dominate space.
Mm-hmm. And I guess all of those combined effects really add up to a serious amount of weed control. And I think it also just really allows you to be adaptable. So maybe if you can't, you know, do any pre-emergent tillage or any in-crop weed control, then, you know, planning with your rotation and increasing your seeding rate and using the right cultivar or even intercropping really just allows you to be adaptable.
And being adaptable is really important, especially as we face weird things in the weather or situations that we're not familiar with. Or if my go-to was pre-seeding tillage, but it's a wet spring, maybe I need other things that I could do instead. So good plan.
So I think we probably have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Maybe we could go back to that question just about, you know, just throughout this growing season and into harvest, you know, what steps can we take to manage the weed seed bank as opposed to, you know, those early weeds that are coming into your crop?
Yeah, and if we could just flip through the slides one at a time, and I'll just say a teeny bit about each one of them from here. We'll get to until we get through to the combine. Okay, so once the crop is in, you can skim over the surface if you can get it between where the seedling is germinating and where the weeds are, if there's room there, and if you have that level of precision in your operation, you can do that. And then next, the next one, once they're up a little bit, there are some options like harrowing, for instance, that will take care of in-crop weeds. Again, the smaller the weeds, the easier it is to take care of them, but there are options at that point. And next, even for some people, if they've seeded things in rows, there's inter-row cultivation, which can make a big difference. And the next one, there are even some options to allow you to take care of weeds within the crop. The comb cut, for instance, will be able to take care of stiff stem things in cereal crop, but it can also be used up above a little short thing like lentils, for instance. You can cut off the wild mustard, the Canada thistle, the wild oats. That won't really make much difference to the competition that year because much of that competition's already happened, but it will reduce the seed bank for next year, which can be a huge effect as well. And the next one. And we also have to be aware that the combine is a huge weed distribution mechanism. And if we are catching those, there are a couple of options here. Blowing them out the back and catching them in a chaff collector is a great idea. Or you might want to set the combine so that you're actually saving more of those weeds and then clean them out with a quick clean or something like that afterwards. But hoping then not to get so many of the weeds back on the land and not to take a small patch of weeds and blow them into a huge patch of weeds.
Well, I think that was actually a great, all those slides really answered that last question that I had.
That was the plan.
Pardon me?
That was the plan.
Yeah, that was a lot of great information. And I think one thing that I wanted to remind all of the listeners too is that, you know, a lot of the stuff that Brenda just touched on is in the Organic Field Crop Handbook that she was a co-author on. I know that when I first moved back home from BC, I purchased that book and read the whole thing, and it was a really good sort of foundation to organic grain production. So thank you, Brenda, so much for all of those great information. I think now we'll, just because of time, we'll move on and we'll start a discussion with David and Alan. So thank you so much, Brenda.
Oh, you're welcome. And when you're giving kudos for that book, Laura deserves most of those.
Absolutely. And then obviously stick around, and maybe we'll have some questions at the end as well. But I'll start by introducing David and Alan. So David Ruark, along with his wife Diane, son Don, daughter Dorian, and son-in-law John, runs one of Manitoba's largest organic farms, Ruark Farms Organics, near Minto, Manitoba. The Ruarks transitioned to organic from conventional no-till in 2016. David has identified a lofty set of objectives for the farm, including doubling the speed at which the farm creates soil organic matter, quadrupling profit, increasing farm diversity, eliminating the use of fossil fuels, and increasing the nutrient density of food produced on the farm. Prior to the transition, David farmed conventionally while acting as president and CEO of AgQuest. AgQuest, founded in 1983, is the largest independent agricultural research provider in the Prairies. David has BSc and master's degrees in agriculture from the University of Manitoba. Thanks so much for being with us, David. I'll introduce Alan as well. So Alan McKenzie, he farms a 4,000 acre cattle and grain farm near Nesbitt, Manitoba, on land purchased from his grandmother. The farm transitioned to organic starting in 2002, and all crops and livestock have been certified since 2011. Alan is experimenting with regenerative principles, incorporating a high degree of plant diversity and living roots. Weeds are not a big problem when were not a big problem when much of the land was in perennial pastures. But as Alan moved away from a perennial system with livestock grazing to annual crops on land rotated through a series of cash crops such as hemp, mustard, wheat, and multi-species cash crops, weeds have obviously become a bigger issue. So since then, Alan has relied on a mix of cultural and mechanical practices to manage weeds in the system. So I have a couple of questions lined up for you guys. Why don't we start with you, David? So I was hoping you could describe your production system and crop rotation and really the types of weeds that are most problematic in your system as well.
I had prepared a slide presentation. Do you want me to go through that now?
Absolutely. Yeah, we can go through the slides, and then I'm assuming you'll probably answer most of my questions if we just go through the slides as well.
See if I can make it work. Can you see that?
Yep, we can see it. Maybe, yeah, I think you'll be able to move through them as well. You might have to just click that enable editing at the top there.
Okay,
and
just
then
a second, Dorian.
If you go to the bottom right, there's that little sort of framed image of the slide that'll fill the screen.
Okay, so our weed control toolbox. So besides improving soil fertility, weed control is often the difference between just getting by and having a lot of fun on your organic farm. And we know firsthand what weeds can do. We use kind of some of these traditional tools, but not so much the plow. One thing that we would like to experiment more with is a wide blade cultivator. We tried a little bit this year. It's really good at pulling out Canada thistle rhizomes, but we had 40% of the average precipitation, and the wear factor on our tillage equipment was just atrocious this year. We could wear out a set of reversible points in 600 acres on the deep tiller, so we kind of minimized our tillage because Mother Nature wasn't cooperating. But generally, tillage is a compromise, and you need to balance the tillage about pulling the weeds, perennials, moisture loss, erosion of the soil, mineralizing the soil organic matter so that we can get better nutrients availability. But I think the key to soil health in organic is trying to minimize that length of fallow. And we have great plans to do that, but again, Mother Nature, if it doesn't rain, it makes it a little bit hard to get all your seeding and cover crops in. So I put down what, basically our process. We have to pay a lot of attention to our rotations. Brenda indicated, trying to make sure that we have the most competitive crop that we can, and making sure we have good fertility, good varieties, good seed. We found out hard way this spring that we had one lot of soybeans that didn't have the vigor we thought it would, and certainly weed control on that. Those was not nearly as good as where we had a better variety and even just a better lot. When it comes to mechanical, certainly we like to try to. It's always, let's say, it's always a compromise. If you till less, you get more perennials. If you till more, you tend to get more annuals. And depending on the weeds in that particular field and the crop, sometimes we want to do a lot of tillage, and other times, well, we actually never want to do a lot of tillage, but sometimes we're kind of forced to try to make sure that thistles don't get away on us. Secondary tillage, certainly we need a good seed bed in the spring. Sometimes, depending on the crop, a scale cultivator, pack them, try to encourage the weeds to grow, and then we'll cultivate it again as needed thereafter. We're quite in favor of a lot of post-seeding operations. We have a wide variety of harrows, so anywhere from kind of a 3/8 tine light harrow to an organic tine, long tine harrows. We have used the rotary hoe, but it's really, it takes a lot of passes to make a difference, and if we can use the harrow, it's usually much more effective. We haven't played with steam, but there's other people in Saskatchewan that keeps telling me that will be an option before too long. And then post-emergent, we harrow some more. Gets kind of dusty for sure, but that's the only way we can keep those small or kill the weeds at the white thread stage, early emergent stage. And it's actually quite effective even against wild oats and wheat. And once we're kind of done, used all the harrowing options, we do have some camera guided row crop cultivators. We've gone to a 30-inch row. We do have a comb cut. We have a Elasco lightning rod, which is kind of good to either do patches of thistles or get the taller growing weeds in the soybeans. We're toying with some biologicals. I'd really like to resurrect biomal, which was used for roundleaf mallow. There's a few organic herbicides, mostly based on vinegar. We haven't used them. They're very expensive. There's some talk about microbes and robotics, and the weed seed two options that would help weed seeds that go through the combine. But unfortunately, things wild oats often shell out before. It's really not going to help.
And I'm assuming, a lot of these post-emergent practices, they're relatively new to organics and organics on the prairie. So I guess as you've moved towards moving some of these post-emergent tools, have you seen sort of species diversity and weeds sort of change over time, or even just throughout your experience as a longtime organic farmer, how has sort of the weeds changed over time?
I guess we probably haven't been in it as long, as say Al or Brenda's observations, but a lot of this is fairly predictable. Like say, if you don't till, you're going to get a lot of perennials. You till a lot and pulverize the soil, things like green fox till. So there's a lot of knowledge in the literature that would give you a pretty good insight in terms of what's going to become, say, resistant to any kind of a repeated operation. Again, you needing diversity and as many tools as you can get to just kind of keep ahead of the weeds.
Mm-hmm.
So our actual plan right now is basically a 3-year rotation, which could be repeated for another 3 years with different crops, but generally we start with a green manure. We like to terminate that, and in theory we would reseed that or have it species that we could mow and get a longer seed. After we're done with the green manure, we would want to sow a catch crop, a smother crop, or a phosphate solubilized crop. And if we could get enough density there, we would be able to know so next year. So second year would be that again, that high nitrogen using wheat or crop such as wheat, or other people certainly use the ones that are more profitable. It was our intention again this year to sow in a rye after some weed competition and perhaps being able to do some green seeding. We did last. Wouldn't recommend soybeans because it's really too late, but peas or even yellow mustard might be an option that might make more sense. But in the third year, we've gone to a on 30 intro. There we can harrow post-emergently and row crop cultivate and can get pretty decent crop. Again, creeping rooted perennials, they're not because have been trying to not let them get ahead. Actually tame them down pretty good in the last 2 years, but as we can, we will try to get more aggressive.
So David, unfortunately, I think the audio is, I'm getting a lot of, it's cutting out quite a bit. So, and maybe just because of time as well, I think that might be a good place to move over to Alan, just so, because we've covered some of the techniques that you've used, and we've covered your rotation, which is good. So let's move over to Alan now. Sorry for everyone if that was cutting out for you as well. So Alan, why don't we start? Can you describe your production system and crop rotation, and I guess some of the types of weeds that are most problematic to your production system?
Okay, we're hardcore perennial for quite a few years, and then we basically switched out of a lot of alfalfa into more of a cash crop setting with a little bit of perennial left. We use a little bit of alfalfa still in the system, but not near where we were at one time. Much like David's talking to there, 3-year rotation now is our main component. We've got, whether it's a wheat or a yellow mustard, followed by probably the second year would be a legume of some sort, or a oat underseeded back to sweet clover, alfalfa, something like that. We're always trying to get diversity in the system, so any place where we can, we'll have, say, even on that first year crop, we'll have an underseed with sweet clover, hairy vetch, a bit of Italian ryegrass, maybe a pound of turnip. And what we're looking at in this system is basically a lot of diversity and crop competition. So we just want to try to get everything growing that we want there, and there'll be enough, hopefully, pressure that the weeds aren't really going to amount to much in that setting. This way we can also utilize it later on in the fall for cattle grazing and stuff like that. I like the idea of going back and seeding the cover crop, but usually by the time we get the weed off, we're running out of time that year. So there's just not enough growth that way. So if we can manage to seed everything in one shot, we'll try to do that with a lot of our crops. Probably 70% we're trying to do that with having a relay, or I shouldn't even say a relay, an interseed at the same time. The big ones we're struggling with now, thistles. Since we've got out of the perennial rotation, the thistles are definitely our number one. Quackgrass is another one that we are fighting with, but that's almost going back to a perennial setting. Sometimes the alfalfa on certain fields there, if you left it in for enough time, you kind of struggle with that one for a while to clean that back up again. And the new one for me that I never had an issue with before, but since we've started incorporating a lot of manure in our system and bringing up the nitrogen levels, is red root pigweed, lamb's quarter. So all of a sudden, if I want to go on my plow down year and incorporate, say, a warm season mix, we'll sometimes take a sweet clover crop off for silage end of June. That helps to clean up any thistles and that too. And then I'll try to get a warm season grazing mix back in. But all of a sudden, we've had years where the lamb's quarter red root pigweed will pretty much take over that crop there, and then you almost have to either clip it or graze it, mob graze it to try to keep that under control. If not, we can actually even lose our sorghum and our warm season mix that way, just due to high fertility soils.
And would you say that you know, a lot of your weed control tactics are these multi-species cash crops and then grazing as well, or are you adding some mechanical weed control in there as well?
A combination of the three, yeah. The biggest problem we face, a lot of our land isn't conducive for running cattle on. We're too spread out, so we don't have enough. We can't run the animals on a lot of the different fields are too far apart. So we are using some mechanical. We don't do anything in crop, just basically on our plow down year, we'll try to get our handle on our perennial weeds, especially then we'll do kind of a mini summer fall. Prime example, this year we had to, instead of going with my warm season grazing mix there, I had a field that was bad for thistles, so we just end up summer falling for the rest of the year once we plowed the clover in and incorporated our manure, just to get a handle on that. So this is the first year I've ever tried. I did a little bit of harrowing behind that one wheat field there after seeding. Other than that, it's usually a case of a early seeding, pre-emergent cultivation pass or a rod weeder pass or something like that. We've had really good success with the rod weeder different times of the year, spring and in the summer. That's when you really get a handle on that quackgrass and thistle control, that mechanical route. And then if we have fields that we don't have something underseeded on, we'll be out right now this time of the year trying to kill something right before a hard frost, but we're trying to balance the soil health compared to tillage. So it's hard when you're trying to keep lots of sweet clovers and hairy vetches in the system, and I like that underseed so I can work it up the next spring or clip it or graze it, and I've got options. But if you don't do enough fall tillage, you start ending up hitting the wall too.
So what if we're talking about sort of your long-term vision of the farm, you know, what are some of those goals to sort of reduce the impact of tillage?
Try more mob grazing. So try to incorporate cattle on other pieces of land. Just trying to figure out how we can make it worthwhile to haul those animals there for a full season or something like that. And then all of a sudden it's worthwhile trying to trailer them 8-10 miles away and set up infrastructure. Yeah. So I'm hoping if we can start incorporating, like I said, some more mob grazing on some of these fields, that maybe that will allow us to cut back on the tillage, because we're finding, just as David said too, that the summer falling definitely is good for the perennials, but then all of a sudden you kind of create another monster that way. And plus for us, we can really utilize that second crop growing there in the fall for grazing and that. So you sure miss it when you have that ground black till later on in the year. And then by the time we sow a winter wheat on that, or some sort of fall crop, there's not going to be enough growth there to really amount to too much. So I'd say that's kind of be the going forward, is trying to incorporate more livestock into the system. Or
Absolutely. David, maybe we could go back to you and I'll ask you that same question is, what are some of your long-term goals or visions for the farm when it comes to reducing the impact of tillage?
Yeah, it's difficult to reduce the tillage and still maintain the yields. But some of the things we can do on the green manure year, particularly, like I said, I think that the real negative part of tillage is how long you fallow. So, if you terminate your green manure, if you can do it by mowing and getting a second flush of, say, double cut red clover, and then leaving that till later in the season, that'll all reduce the tillage. Certainly, if you can sow a second crop after the initial tillage or termination in a green manure, and then let that overwinter and die over winter and sow into it, that would allow an opportunity to direct seed. After the wheat, we could put in a fall rye. We could let that grow till spring. We can terminate it then, or like I said, we did try a little bit of green seeding. I went out with just a plot drill in some standing rye. I had soybeans in the drill because that's kind of what they've been really successful down in the States, but it was already after the seeding date deadline for soybeans. I thought, well, this is kind of silly. I went home and got some yellow mustard, and I should have got some peas because they were still within the seeding deadlines of those crops. So we have to look at all those as options of how we can reduce tillage. But it's also a compromise between moisture. Did that fall rye in our limited rainfall area already use the moisture? And if you don't get a timely rain, you're not going to get much of a crop in that green seeding. So, we're still struggling to figure out how we can adapt some of those good practices that they're doing further south into our relatively short season, sometimes very limited moisture. And last year was kind of ideal for moisture in terms of the spring, or maybe a little excessive, but we had lots of soil moisture, so we could get those crops started even with the rye. But after that initial rainfall, it didn't rain again, and those crops were not as good as if they would have been seeded early. And just to reinforce the seeding date, I did a bunch of small plot replicated work, and seeding date in wheat was early May was 61 bushels, mid-May was about 54 bushels, and early June was around 32 bushels an acre of wheat. And those were fairly clean plots, but we actually had more weeds with the late seeding wheat in that case. So it's just, as they say, the devil's in the detail. It's fine to try to figure out all these elaborate plans during the winter, but Mother Nature may not cooperate in the summer. So then you have to have a plan B. And unfortunately, sometimes it's the tillage that kind of saves the day, but at least in the short run. But it's certainly our objective to try to figure out how to do the regenerative agriculture and organic, but it's more challenging than it would be if you had some glyphosate and could kill stuff once in a while without turning it over. But I think we just need to keep using our imagination, like the green seeding with not soybeans, but something else that we can put in there that is adapted.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to sort of wrap things up is, we just need to use our imagination and, keep being adaptable and sharing knowledge with each other. So I think it's 12, I have 12:56. thank you guys so much for coming and chatting with us and being a part of this. I think at this point, I'll hand it back to Karen, who I believe is going to sort of, I might have a couple more slides and then we'll sort of wrap things up. So thanks again for being here today, guys.
You're welcome.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks, Will, for moderating this, and thanks, yeah, and to the rest of your team at the University of Manitoba, and thanks to Brenda, Ellen, and David for sharing their insights with us, and to Laura Telford for putting this whole series together. I just wanted to reiterate our thanks to our sponsors. We had FCC helping to sponsor this this webinar. We had Weed Surfer, McDon, and MASC also. All right, so please tune in for our next webinar. That'll be on November the 18th at 12 p.m., same time. And it will be on small seeded broadleaf weeds. And we have Dr. Aaron Silva and Jason Peters. So hopefully we'll see you then. Thanks so much and have a great rest of the day.